So good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Lindholm. I'm actually with Suse out of Detroit, Michigan. I manage a team of pre-sales solutions architects across the Midwest and the Northeast. I really appreciate the opportunity to get out here face-to-face with the room this morning. Have no concerns about the number of people here. It's just good to be able to get out and about and interact with people. I'm sure we've all had enough of our Zoom sessions in the basement office and or looking at how we are engaging remotely. One of the things that I'll reflect on the pandemic is just the progress that Suse has made over the past 2 years, looking at being spun out from Micro Focus, set up as a standalone organization, and ultimately IPOing last year. Our growth has been very consistent through the pandemic. And frankly, we've been growing our portfolio of solutions significantly. Suse last year acquired Rancher Labs. If you're not familiar with Rancher Labs is leading provider of Kubernetes management infrastructure, looking at what I would call full life cycle management of Kubernetes deployments in the concept of Kubernetes everywhere, of how do I deploy, manage, and maintain Kubernetes in your on-premises environment, in the public cloud, or even out at the edge. When you look at things like the edge, those are deployment domains in which I think we have some significant competitive advantage, looking at our time to market, our ability to accelerate our customers' project initiatives, and just looking at the technology. We've got a pretty significant lead in our packaging for the edge, looking at Rancher and what they've done with K3S, and which is a cloud native compute foundation certified Kubernetes distribution. It's a single binary. It's under 100 megabytes in size, and it can actually run a full Kubernetes distribution on embedded infrastructure. And the ability to manage that at scale is really a big differentiator for a number of our customers. Predominantly today, I'm here to talk to you a bit about a more recent acquisition that Suse completed a couple of months back, looking at a company called NewVector. NewVector, if you're familiar with them, is a leading provider of full stack container security, looking at a layered approach to deliver secure supply chain, looking at the software that's being deployed within the Kubernetes infrastructure and providing assurance at each step in the path, looking at the development pipelines and the different inflection points within the infrastructure, but more importantly, the runtime execution, monitoring the ability to get visibility into the network is another part of that. So before I jump into this, I am actually going to skip to one other slide down here and give you a little bit of background about Suse, just in keeping with the company. We've been in the market for over 29 years. Our 30th anniversary in terms of collaborating with the open source Linux community and looking at our driving of the enterprise Linux space is absolutely coming up here this year. Solutions are not limited to enterprise Linux per se. We've got enterprise management capabilities looking at cross-distribution Linux management, as well as the Rancher technology that was mentioned a while back. We've got a pretty impressive growth track, even through the pandemic, looking at growth in the public cloud, growth in an on-prem environment. And the partnerships are definitely there to support our customers in their varied environments, looking at the technology portfolios and the mixed nature of how people are deploying infrastructure these days. There are really three key areas that we bring solutions to market, looking at business critical Linux. This is really focusing on uptime, availability, resilience, security. That whole secure software supply chain is endemic through the packaging of our Linux offerings, as well as our containerized infrastructure. When we look at enterprise container management, this is predominantly the Rancher portfolio, and it's really looking at containers in Kubernetes and really reducing the complexity and the time to deploy, ultimately giving customers the same experience with a dashboard or a programmable software API that can be automated and providing a consistent management experience, not only for the managed environment, but downstream clusters that could number into the one to many to the thousands. The idea is that we can help get some economies of scale and provide for some consistency. NewVector very much complements what we've been up to there, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. The edge business, as mentioned, is really beyond an emerging market at this point. I would say that it is a focus looking at how people are interacting with connected infrastructure and how we can help organizations really invest in that connectivity, keep it secure, and really provide that experience. So to kind of wrap up with the portfolio side of this, the anchor is really consumption across the environments you see across the bottom, looking at the developers and enabling their experience with tools that compete in the marketplace with things like Docker Desktop. We have a Rancher Desktop offering that allows for Kubernetes to be deployed locally for development purposes, data center deployments. We have both Docker and Containerd-based Kubernetes solutions that can absolutely be deployed to manage the scale-out infrastructure, as well as the cloud, and ultimately we'll move up the stack from there. So let's go back up to the beginning here. When we look at the securing of the infrastructure, one of the reasons that Suse has such a focus on the security of the stack, and really has been a focus in our enterprise Linux offerings as well as the containerized infrastructure, is that we're really trying to accelerate customers' deployment initiatives. We've got a lot of people with a lot of infrastructure looking at virtual machines and their desires to get to cloud native. The question is how can they get there a little bit more quickly? How can we make this easier while at the same time mitigate the risk? Because what you'll realize in most of my customer conversations, and I guess I'll query the room here, is you look at containerization, it's been very much impactful to the developer experience, looking at how people are producing software and looking at the development process and how agile we can be in making software available to consume. Now that we've got maturity at the Kubernetes layer, the security tools are emerging, and the market is looking at this for productive deployment purposes, whether it be in the public cloud or on-prem. We need to make sure that we're not sacrificing any of the security controls or any of the economy that you would expect in trade for the speed. We need to be able to provide the time to market as well as the assert the security at the same time. When we look at the container security control hierarchy, Rancher and NuVector play at different layers in terms of the stack, but the NuVector offering is really focused on providing a zero trust framework that is really looking at a layered approach to securing a containerized infrastructure. And this includes the complete development pipeline in terms of how people are developing and committing changes, looking at the typical practices of using GitLab, Jenkins to commit software changes and have containers and infrastructure build and automatically rebuild, so that we're moving very quickly and making it very easy for the developers to do their job. At the same time, we need to be able to have visibility into that environment to make sure that each of those container registries and infrastructure repositories, looking at where you're storing your infrastructure as code, where you're configuring your deployment YAML, and ultimately moving to the runtime execution layer, we need to be able to assert a certain level of control and be able to provide the visibility on the networking side. When we look at the runtime execution, the CVE management in particular is very robust, looking at the currently deployed infrastructure and the ability to introduce a concept of admission controls to make sure that as we're building, maintaining, and deploying new assets, that we're keeping things secure within the policy that's been declared by the security principles within your organization. To give you a little bit of background with respect to the traditional workflow here, if you're not familiar with how the cloud native development experience would go, this is a pretty typical example of a developer potentially working on their source code. They may be posting that in a source repository like GitHub, for example, at which point they have a pipeline that will automatically compile and basically package that software, and it'll be published to a registry. The runtime environment will then pull those containers as part of the deployment manifest, and at each step in the path, NuVector has the ability to assert visibility, as well as controls around how software is being consumed within the environment. Vulnerabilities can enter at any stage in the pipeline, specifically looking at misconfiguration, looking at software that has remediation that might need to be fixed, looking at networking and connectivity. There are new attack surfaces that need to be managed, and if you look at everything from the service meshes like Istio to the pod-to-pod communications, one of the things you'll see in the runtime execution environment is a very high level of capability, specifically looking at the network visibility. If you look at the solution that we'll get into in a few minutes, you'll see things like deep packet inspection, data loss prevention, and some AI framework that is really there to help the environment learn about the deployment patterns in your system and some of the capabilities we have around the web application firewall, as well as the container control framework that is included within the system will actually allow you to put controls around that zero-day conversation of creating a whitelist around what is expected behavior for your containerized environment, specifically thinking about what ports, what files, what interfaces, and what infrastructure can communicate with each other, basically allowing for a bit of zero-day protection to occur at the same time here. One other thing that you need to keep in mind here is, even though we want all this to be secure, we need the pipeline to continue working, and the developers need to be enabled to self-correct, meaning that from an infrastructure perspective, you think about how organizations are remediating security vulnerabilities in the environment. The engineering and the operations staff need time to be able to control that, and we'll talk about how New Vector can basically allow you to create flexible policies that handle admission control and the like. So capability is really built into two different sets of capability. Capabilities are really built into two different sets of common functions, specifically looking at the supply chain of the development pipeline, as well as the runtime security capabilities. The table stakes for sure include the risk reporting and remediations. You'll find that the interface that we've provided with the New Vector environment is fully open source, and to that end, it's accessible and extensible in terms of basically getting in through the standards-based interfaces, looking at the different steps in the process, looking at build scanning, the registry scanning, benchmarks being ran against existing container infrastructure, to be able to pull the reports so that you can assert your compliance and have the assistance you need with making sure that your security has been dealt with appropriately. When you look at the runtime scanning capability, really gets back to the container, the host, the platform. When we move to the runtime protection conversation, this is really where we start thinking about, all right, I have a secure supply of ingredients that are being assembled, looking at the infrastructure as code. This is where we can basically put in place admission controls that have logic that basically states, for example, via security policy, whether or not you have fully asserted the security of the environment, looking at, are there known vulnerabilities, or have you met the threshold where this could be a problem? Ultimately, the Zero Trust framework implements itself as a security policy as code implement that runs in parallel with the deployment YAML for the Kubernetes consumption. When we look at the capabilities of the runtime environment, the admission controls allow you to basically put policies in, for example, that would say, if I have a high vulnerability CVE, yeah, I may be aware of it, I want to report on it. If that vulnerability has been there for more than 7 days and it's not been remediated by the development team, we may take further action, right? Or if I have a combination of occurring factors, specifically looking at the number of vulnerabilities or workload that seems to be languishing in terms of maintenance, yeah, we might quarantine a container or quarantine a workload looking at a deployment within the Kubernetes environment. The container firewall, as well as the web application firewall, are really getting into the pod-to-pod network communications and the data loss prevention layer, specifically looking at layer 7 visibility with respect to the network. The AI and the ML within the environment also has a behavioral learning component that does allow for the environment to learn what I would call the whitelist behavior of the containerized infrastructure, so that the zero-day vulnerability protection can absolutely be asserted, looking at only allowing what I would consider to be valid transactions to proceed as part of the normal course of operating. When we look at the execution mode for the zero trust container infrastructure, you have a choice of either running it in monitor mode or protect mode. Ultimately, the monitoring mode allows us to alert to any behavior that would be considered on the radar and interesting. Protect mode would also deny that anomalous behavior. The discovery capabilities are really looking at the trending in the network connectivity and some of the visibility there. And really how we scale this is the security policy as code element, because every workload you're deploying in Kubernetes requires a deployment YAML. The idea would be that as you're building that deployment YAML, you also need a security definition for each of these deployments that defines the different constraints and the different requirements for operating within the environment. So unique capabilities here are really complementary to the Rancher portfolio. What I would offer for consideration is that Suse acquired NewVector early this year. In February, we made the first open source commit for the contribution of the NewVector intellectual property to the open source community. This is in the process of being integrated with the Rancher marketplace, making it easy to deploy and consume. And frankly, if you look at the NewVector capabilities, they're not only limited to Rancher Kubernetes, but could frankly be used in an OpenShift environment or any Cloud Native Compute Foundation certified Kubernetes infrastructure. The automation is definitely a standout capability here in terms of the policy-based controls. The networking visibility, specifically looking at the web application firewall, and the ability to craft zero trust protection as part of the controls, looking at the network process and file access, and getting in that deep at the container level is another part of the unique capability. To kind of finish us up, looking at an example of how we've had an impact with our customers. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the exploits of Log4j of late. Log4j is a common used open source component that is enabling a lot of applications to communicate effectively. And ultimately, this vulnerability has had a pretty big impact on a lot of customers' infrastructure, meaning that there's been a good deal of remediation. Firstly, the first requirement is visibility to where customers have exposure, right? And that's going to come in the form of detection and remediation, specifically looking at the registry scan capabilities, as well as the runtime scanning, looking for code that's executing that is known to be vulnerable, looking at the CVEs. The system could then suggest remediation and or put policy in place if that remediation has not been taken in a reasonable amount of time. We do offer continuous protection factors, specifically looking at the container firewall, as well as the container workload security factors, putting some additional control around these deployments. And if you think about it from a zero trust perspective, these CVEs evolved. There was an initial bug that was fixed, at which point there were 3 or 4 other follow-up CVEs that were identified. Ultimately, again, the operations team needs time to deal with this, but if we were taking best practices into consideration, one of the things we could do is write a rule that basically puts controls into the egress side of the container infrastructure so that these workloads cannot communicate outbound with any kind of bot master or control infrastructure, looking at further cutting off the exploit. So the day zero response is absolutely there, looking at the zero-day capabilities and getting the visibility to where do I have exposures and giving the developers time to remediate the problems, Following day one, it really comes back to what other security can we introduce, looking at filters at layer 7, looking at URLs, looking at other policies within the web application firewall that allows for better controls over ingress and, more importantly, controls over egress as well. Ultimately, I'm going to encourage everybody to not look at cloud security as an afterthought. It's not necessarily built in. This needs to be taken into consideration regardless of where you're deploying, whether it's in your on-premises environment, the public cloud, or the edge. And the automation is really key. And if you are able to get ahead of the game as you're ramping up your production deployments, you can make a significant impact in investing in the security of your infrastructure overall. So really appreciate everybody's time today, and I will hand it back over to Ron.